Continue our way through the book of Exodus, and I really kind of struggled on where to divide this, if I wanted to do something separate on the Ten Commandments or if I wanted to kind of tie all this together. I landed on tying all this together because I think that helps us kind of get a broader picture of what is happening in the book. And so we're going to go from Exodus 19:1, which is when they arrive at Sinai and everything begins to happen, all the way through Exodus 20:17, which is the Ten Commandments. And then next week we'll kind of pick up after that. And so that's kind of where we're going to be today. And what we're going to see is that even though God's been working to do all these things, right? We've seen God work on behalf of the people. We saw God begin to work through the people, right? As he now began to work through Moses and he began to work through the people in their fight, right? All of these things have been going on. And at this point, we begin to see that God begins to establish his covenant with his people. That God is now establishing who are they going to be in relation to him. And he really begins to work this out with them, really starting from this point, essentially through the remainder of the book, right, is now kind of outlining the Sinai event and the giving of the law and the temple and then its construction and all of these different things are going to take place over the course of the next several weeks. And as we begin to work our way through this, chapter 19 through the Ten Commandments, what we begin to see is that God is holy and calls people to be holy. Right, and that's kind of the picture that begins to be presented about this people that God is going to set apart from himself, their consecration unto him, and then this revelation of God's will in the Ten Commandments, right? All of that is circling around God is holy, and he's calling his people to be holy. And he's giving them a picture of what that looks like for them to be holy. And that's kind of what we're all going to begin to work through these next few passages, right, is thinking through God's call to his people as a holy God to be a holy people. It's not always easy, and we see some important things begin to play out in this. And so I don't know, have any of y'all ever owned like a lava lamp? A throwback? We got a few. I suspect there's some people that were too afraid to stick their hands up. But essentially, right, you have this picture in a lava lamp, or if you've ever just tried to mix water and oil, right, the essence of what a lava lamp is, right? If you ever just tried to mix water and oil, it just does not work, right? You can try, right? You can even take the bottle and you can shake it real good and it'll mix for a second, but then inevitably it separates out again. Right? As you work your way through Exodus 19, that's kind of the picture that's being presented between God and his people. That God is holy. And because he is holy, there is still, and will continue to be even from this point, a separation between him and his people. Because his people are not holy like he is. And so while they might try to make it work or they might try to fix some things, there's still ultimately this separation between them and God. And so God says, in the midst of this, because you are separated from me and you can't come to me, let me come down to you and begin to make a way for you to have community with me. Let me begin to make a path and a way that we may have relationship. Because as it stands, because of sin and brokenness, we can't have that relationship. Right? There's a separation that exists. And for the first time in the book of Exodus, God begins to speak directly to his people. Or at least that's the implication that plays out through chapter 19 and picked up again after the Ten Commandments in chapter 20. Is that God is now coming to his people and saying, no, let me come and speak directly to you about how you, an unholy, broken, sinful people, can have relationship and community with a holy and righteous God. And so what we see play out in these Ten Commandments is not just simply this idea of how to be a good, moral person. But it's a picture of how do God's people reflect the holy nature of God himself. And God is going to begin to explain this and play all this out. And thankfully for us, to give you a highlight to the end of the message today, right? All of this plays out different this side of the cross. And praise God for that wonderful gift, right? And so as we work our way through here, the very first piece in this passage is that we see that this initial call to God's people to be holy. And so at the very beginning of 19, I'm going to pick up at verse 3. And so verse 3 Moses went up the mountain to God. Right? So he's going up, he's ascending Mount Sinai, one of at least 2 or 3 ascensions that play out through this passage. He goes up, and the Lord called to him from the mountain. This is what you are to say to the house of Jacob and explain to the Israelites. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I carried you on eagle's wings. I've been hanging out with Patrick too long, apparently. And brought you to myself. Now, if you will carefully listen to me and keep my covenant, you will be my possession out of all peoples. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be my kingdom of priests in my holy nation. And these are the words that you were to say to the Israelites. And then Moses descends, he makes this message to them, and the Israelites then go on to say that they will do all of these things. Right? But we see ultimately this beginning picture that God is setting apart for himself a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. And he's setting apart something very specific, right? Because he says just before that, right, I'm setting apart for myself the people of Israel. And what does he say right after that? Even though all the earth is mine. Right? So it's not like Israel is God's possession, but no one else is God's possession. No, God is coming to Israel and saying, no, I am setting you apart for something very specific. To be this holy representation of me in the world and a kingdom of priests through whom I can redeem all of the nations. That Israel is to function as the priest for all people, that he may be a blessing to all nations, and that God may draw all people back into this relationship with him, even though he already has authority over all of them. He's setting them apart for a very particular task. Right? My dad used to say this, although never practiced it himself, right? You get the right tool for the right job, right? I have a whole tool set at home, and all of those tools can do any number of different things, right? Fix things, destroy things, try to fix things but accidentally destroy them because of who's using them. Any number of things, right? But if I need to do certain tasks, I go to certain tools to get those things. Because it's only that tool that can do the purpose. Even though all the tools belong to me, I have to get the right one. And so what God is coming, and God is saying, hey, look, I own all of them. All the tools are mine, but I need a special tool for a special purpose. And that special tool for the special purpose is that you will reflect my holiness to everyone. That you will be a kingdom of priests, drawing the nations back into relationship with me. Because just like the Israelites, all of the nations are marked by sin and separated from God. And so God is working diligently to draw them back. And he is going to do that through this people, a holy people established on earth for a particular purpose, that God's holiness may be on display and they may be drawn near to him. And he begins all of this by reminding them who he is and what he's done. Right? Remember what I've done in your life. Remember that I'm the one who brought you out of Egypt. Remember that through all of these other things that you've experienced in this time, that I have carried you on eagle's wings. Remember what I have done. And as you remember what I have done, as an act of worship back to me, now come and live according to what I'm calling you to. That you may be this people. Right? He's not calling them out of their own goodness, right? He's not calling them saying, hey, work your way to this. But he's reminding them, hey, remember what I've done. Therefore, you should look this way. And actually, you see the exact same thing in Exodus 20 right before the Ten Commandments. Right? Exodus 20, verse 1. Then God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the place of slavery. Right? So he doesn't begin with, hey, you need to be better. You need to be good so that you can be what I want you to be. No, what God is saying is, no, I've been at work doing all of these things already so that you can be set apart. Now, out of a responsive obedience and worship, come to me, that you may be a blessing to all nations. And this idea of priesthood is their ultimate role, right? That just as the priests for Israel were the ones who could make sacrifice for them, that they may have this relationship with God ongoing, right? This idea that they are a nations of priests plays out the same way, right? That through them, God was at work through all the nations. Just as today, God is at work through all of the nations as a priest, or as a church, right? And that's what we see in 1 Peter, right? That you are a royal priesthood, built up as the church, that God may proclaim to the nations his desire to bring them to himself. Because just like then and now is the same, right? That we are all separated from God by our sin. And God is at work to establish this holy people because he is a holy God. So he's establishing in this context the people of Israel to do this, that they may come back to him, constantly reminding them, remember who I am and what I have done. Now respond to me in obedience, that I may establish you among all of the nations for a very special and particular purpose, to make a holy God known to the people. But for him to be known, the people had to be holy. The people had to be a reflection of him, so that as the nations saw them, they did not just simply see the people of Israel, but they saw the God that they served. That they were getting a glimpse at God himself. And God was making that display known through his people. So what we see is he begins to transition now from this initial call that you will be a holy nation and a blessing, right? As now he begins to talk about his coming to speak with them and their need to consecrate themselves because God is going to draw near to them. Even though God is holy and separated from them, he's on this totally different plane. He says, no, I still am going to come and draw near to my people. And if I'm going to do this, what they have to do is prepare themselves for being in my presence. Because this holy God desires to commune with his people, desires to be with them, to have relationship with them, even though they've messed just about everything up to this point. They've gotten virtually nothing right. Moses himself didn't even want to be a part of this. And yet God is still saying, no, I want to come and draw near to you. I want to have this relationship with you. So never let yourself be deceived into thinking that I am not good enough for God to want to draw near to me. God desires to have an intimate relationship with you. God desires to be known by you and for you to know him, to draw near to him in his word, to walk with him. And God, it's not because God needs us. It's not like God has this desperate need for people to love him, but it's that God just so desires that we would have a relationship with him because of the great love that he has for us. Not out of some need that he has, but out of a desperate love. What a beautiful picture. That God, who has authority over all things, still says that my desire is for you. My desire is that you would have this relationship with me, that you would draw near to me. But the problem that now begins to play out is, yes, God is calling his people to holiness, but his people are still not holy. And so what do they have to do? They have to consecrate themselves, prepare themselves for drawing near in God's presence. And what does God say as you work your way through chapter 19? What you end up beginning to see is he tells Moses, go back down to the people, tell them that in 3 days I'm going to come down in this dense cloud and come and speak to them So tell them over these next 3 days to begin to consecrate themselves, and when on the third day they hear the horn, they will be able to come into my presence. Hold on to this for next week, because we're going to come back to this idea. We're going to kind of skip over it a little bit for today. Right? But God calls all the people to come to his presence. And says, hey, I want to have community with you. Not just Moses, not just Aaron, not just the priesthood, but all of them. Come and have communion with me. But for that to happen, because you are broken and sinful and separated from me, you must consecrate yourselves that you may come into my presence. Otherwise, right, what does it say? His great anger will break out against them. Because even though God is displaying a great love and a desire for them, God is still righteous and just. He still is fully holy. And he still has no part in sin. And so his people must come before him, consecrate themselves, prepare themselves to go into God's presence. But in the beauty in all of this is that even though this is what he requires, in God's grace, he makes a way. He prepares a way for his people to be in his presence. God could have just as easily just said, sorry, you're out of luck. I would desire to be with you. I would desire to be in your presence, but there is no way for you to make yourself holy. And so you're just going to be forever separated from me. But no, God in his grace says, no, I'm going to make a means for you to draw near to me. Because it doesn't work the other way. No matter what his people do, they never can get out of it. And really, ultimately, that's a big piece of the story of the Bible. Is that no matter how hard people try, people still make mistakes. People still don't get it right. So ultimately, what God is calling them is to an obedient reliance upon him. That they obediently say, you know what, I can't do it. Let me rely on you to do it. And if you want kind of an example of that, go read 1 Kings. Samuel anoints Saul to be king, right? Saul messes it up. So God takes the kingdom away from him and gives it to David. David also messes it up. In case you haven't read the story, David messes a lot of things up. He actually does quite a few things wrong. So why did God take the kingdom away from Saul, but not away from David, if it was just about their obedience? The consistent difference between Saul and David in the story is Saul's continued elevation of himself to be this person who God is working through. To say he acts as a priest, he does all of these different things, ignoring the fact that he is a broken person in need of God. David does the opposite. David at every turn continues to look to God to say, what should I do in this case? It would be easy for him to make a lot of different choices. But he continues to rely on God through that. And because of that, God says, no, I will work through you. And so God is setting up something similar here. Right? If you will just rely on me, if you will come before me, consecrate yourselves, dedicate yourselves to me, rely on me, then we can have this communion together. But the moment that you cease to rely on me, problems begin. Again, this whole passage is not simply about this moral obedience to this set of laws. Although, as we're about to get to, that should happen. But only what God is inviting them into. God is saying, I am a holy God who desires to have a holy people. Come into my presence that I may be at work in you, to display my holiness through you, to be at work in your life, making you as I am. And that's ultimately what God then goes on to reveal in the Ten Commandments. That God is revealing his desire for his people. right? That he wants to make them into this holy nation, this nation of priests. He now is getting to the point of like, okay, well, how do you do that? It's one thing to say, hey, yeah, it's great to do that, but now I actually got to figure out what to do. You know, it's like you get a box or you get furniture or you get any number of different things, get a puzzle. If you do not have instructions, or if the puzzle box doesn't have a picture of the puzzle, it becomes a lot harder to do it. You know what you're supposed to do, right? You know, hey, well, this is generally what I'm supposed to do, but you have no direction on how to actually do that. I had some friends who really enjoyed puzzles, and I don't know why they ever did this. I like puzzles, but I would never do this. They bought a puzzle that was the same picture, front and back, just one side was tilted by 10 degrees. And so whenever you would look at a puzzle piece, you had to figure out which side was up from down. I can't imagine, other than just hours of just sitting there and trying piece after piece after piece after piece. But how often is that how we do it spiritually? Let me just try piece after piece after piece after piece, because I'm not heeding what God has already told me about how to draw near. And so instead of having an idea and the direction to go, we just simply sit at the table trying over and over and over out of our own ability and our own strength to get the right piece to fit. And what God is saying, God is outlining, hey, I've given you all the pieces. You know how to do it if you will listen, if you will heed the things that I am saying to you. You know how to draw near. And the very first thing that we see in how to draw near is that we lift him up as God, that we acknowledge who he is, that he is God and there is no other. And everything else flows from that point. That God, through this, is calling us to live our whole life for him. To say, no, dedicate everything you have to me. And this is how you dedicate your life to me. And it ultimately revolves first and foremost of a love for him. And as our love for him overflows, right, we also have the love for each other. That's what Christ says in the New Testament. Right, that the whole law hangs on these two commands. That you love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, that you love your neighbor as yourself. All of that begins here. That God is saying, hey, if you honor me as who I am, here is how your life should look. Because I am calling you to this great task to be a holy nation and a priest to all people, but that requires a lot. And it cannot be done without a continued reliance on the one true God who is above everybody and everything else. There is nothing that can take his place. That he stands alone. And that if we are going to acknowledge him as the one true God, then our worship of him should be correct. That we should worship him in the right ways and not the wrong ways. We should not try to make representations of him out of our own imagines, of our own thoughts of who God is, because God is bigger than we are. That's the whole point of the story up to this point, that he is holy and his people are not. His people cannot comprehend his vastness. And if I cannot comprehend how great and vast he is, why do I think I can create something out of my own mind and my own imagination that will reflect him properly? It won't. So do not worship in that fashion, because it's not a proper reflection of who God is. It is just simply a reflection of the things that I think about him, but not him himself. And if there is only one God, then my worship of him should be correct. I should come to him acknowledging who he is. That he is the one who owns all things. He set apart for himself one nation, but he owned all of it. Or we see in Colossians, right, that he has all authority in heaven and on earth. There is nothing that exists without him, that all things exist through him and in him. That now Christ sits with everything set under him as a footstool. That he has it all. So let me acknowledge his greatness. If I acknowledge his greatness, then I'll also acknowledge my desperate need for him. Because I understand who he is in comparison to me. That I pale in comparison. And so I have a desperate need for him. And so if I'm going to believe and acknowledge there is this one true God who needs to be worshiped in the right way, then I should carry his name properly. That my life should be a proper reflection of him. That I am not living out something contrary to him. That I'm not acting or speaking or doing in ways that are contrary to him. But that I should honor his name as holy. And live in accordance to what he's called me to. Not going halfway or not half-truths or not, in essence, right, the picture of using the Lord's name in vain. A name symbolized a lot of things in this context. It symbolized your rule, your kingdom, your authority, who you were as a person. And so what he is calling his people to, and not taking his name in vain, is saying, no, you are my representatives throughout all of the earth, so live according to what my name calls you to. Not what anybody else calls you to, not simply to what you think, but to me. And live in accordance to that. And if these are the things that are going to mark your life, then you should live in remembrance of all the things that God has done. Do not place your strength in yourself and just simply the things you can do to get it through, but remember that the Lord himself rested, and as a reflection of your dependence upon him, that you should continue to rest. Because you remember who he is, and you remember who you are. And so remember him. As he begins from this point, right, as he's kind of outlined these beginning things, that there's no other God before me, you should worship me the right way. You are my representative, so carry my name correctly in remembrance of who I am. Now he goes on to outline, what does that look like in your day-to-day life? That you honor your parents. That you hold life as sacred. That you are faithful, not an adulterous people. That you are honest. And honest kind of plays out in a multitude of fashions in this context, right? That you rely on the things that you have, that you work diligently with your hands, not as a thief who steals, right? That you are satisfied with the things that you have and that you do not covet what your neighbor has. And why do you do these things? Because you remember who God is and what he has done. That God values life. That God is truth. That he is our ultimate Father. That God gives me everything that I need, so I have no need for what my neighbor has. God has placed me in this world to work and keep, right, from the very beginning. Let me work diligently. God is calling his people to say, no, you are to be a reflection of me to the nations. And if you will do that through a great love for God, and out of a great love for God, a love for neighbor. That he will be at work through you in your life as you reflect him. Now, the desperate challenge in all of this is that still none of us get it right. As hard as we may try, we still mess it up. I don't honor God as holy every day, all day. I don't live in ways that accord to what I know His character to be. And I constantly fall short. And in the Old Testament, God begins to set provision for that we're going to get to over these next several weeks. That you have a constant means to come back to Him over and over and over because He knows you will not get it right. The bar is set too high. If Adam and Eve could not get it right in the garden, me and you are not going to get it right out of the garden. And God sets a way for them to continue to come to Him. And all of that culminates in the person and the work of Christ. That God is still calling people to Himself. Saying, I desire to have a relationship with you. I love you and I care for you. And so let me make a way that you may come to me. And that way is the cross. That once for all my sins were covered. That when God looks to me, He does not see my brokenness. But when God looks to me, and when I've placed faith in Him, He sees the holiness of His Son. That I may finally have relationship with Him and draw near to Him. That a way that even the Israelites couldn't, even though God was calling them to it. That God has now made a way for me through the cross and now through the indwelling of His Holy Spirit. To be at work in me every day, conforming me to the image of Christ. Why is it important that I conform to the image of Christ? Because I've always been called to be a reflection of Him. What is His ultimate reflection in the world? It is His own Son. So let me continue to form my life to Him. Because God is still holy, and God is still calling people to holiness. God has just said that you will never achieve that on your own. You will only achieve that through faithful obedience, coming to me and saying, I have no way but you. There is nothing I can do to achieve it. All that I can do is come and acknowledge that you are the only God, that there is no one beside you, and that I'm in desperate need of you, and submit our life in faith. And then out of a worshipful obedience of what God has done, say, I'm going to do everything I can to live for Him. Not trying to earn a love that I could never earn, but out of response to a love that I did not deserve. That God loved me to the point of sending His own Son for me. And now let me obediently follow Him. That God might be at work through my life, calling the nations back to Him. Because God desires that none should perish, but that all should come into relationship with Him. That all should come into His holiness through the sacrifice of His Son. And may our lives be a reflection of that.